Deputy Roisin Shortall, please.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, the cost of living package which your Cabinet agreed today is wholly inadequate. It goes nowhere near meeting the desperate need of so many workers and families who are really struggling just to keep their head above water. Once again, your entire focus is on once-off measures. But people need to know how they will pay their soaring bills, not just this week or next week, but next month and the months following that. Ever-increasing numbers of people all over the country are now actually living in fear of the next electricity bill, the next gas bill, the next trip to the supermarket, knowing they can't possibly manage. We know that 30% of parents are skipping meals themselves so that their children have enough to eat. Taoiseach, we're one of the richest countries in the world, and a great many parents are struggling just to provide food for their children. Isn't that shameful? Your package is especially disappointing because you know, and you've even highlighted, the lifelong damage that is caused by child poverty. In fact, when you became Taoiseach, you promised to do everything in your power to tackle child poverty. You don't need a special unit in your department to know that the best way to reduce child poverty is by targeting increased resources at the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children in our society. We know that more than 50% of those living in poverty are lone parents and their children, and people with disabilities and their children. Yet they have been almost completely ignored by your package. You increased the qualified child payment by a measly €2 in this year's budget. €2 for the poorest children in our country, out of a bonanza €11 billion budget package. You've now doubled down in this regard and failed to provide any increase at all to this vital payment. You've also refused to introduce a weekly cost of disability payment, which would recognise the huge additional costs of having a disability. There were other things, of course, that you could have done and that you should have done. Core social welfare rates have fallen way behind the surging cost of living increases across the economy. You've decided to leave those families who are reliant on these payments, pensioners, lone parents, carers, living below the poverty line. You haven't even extended the fuel allowance to low-paid workers on the working family payment. In fact, you have done nothing for families to help them with soaring energy costs. So, Taoiseach, my questions are, when are you going to change approach and provide sustainable supports to those poorest families, those who are most in need?
Thank you, Deputy.
How can you claim to be targeting child poverty when you fail to increase a payment that only the most vulnerable children in our society receive? And when are you going to do something about energy costs?
Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. I don't accept your characterisation of the package announced today, and I'll go into that in some more detail a bit later on. But, I need to emphasise once again, and as I said last week, this isn't a budget. We only had a budget a few months ago. Some of the measures only started kicking in the last few weeks, and some have yet to do so. This wasn't a mini-budget either. This was a series of one-off measures to help people, to help families with children, pensioners and vulnerable people, and also small businesses. And you said earlier that our focus is entirely, or almost entirely, on one-off measures. That's patently untrue. Up until today, we announced 25 individual actions, many of which are permanent. The increase in the pension, €12 a week, only kicked in a few weeks ago. €12 a week in additional weekly welfare payments, and some additional targeted payments as well. Lower income taxes and the rent tax credit. Cheaper childcare, 25% reduction in the cost of childcare for Irish families. Healthcare costs going down. Within a few months, extending free GP care to many more people, which Minister Donnelly is working on at the moment, with a particular emphasis on middle to low income families. The lowest income families have it already. We want to go the next step to those on low to middle income families, lower public transport costs as well, and also making the student grant more available to more people. Minister Harris has done that. More students will be eligible for the student grant at a higher rate come September. And in terms of targeting the most vulnerable, I'll give you the facts, Deputy. €100 payment per child in June. That is universal because all families need a little bit of help. But for those poorest families, the extra €100 on the back-to-school clothing and footwear allowance will be repeated again this year. For families in receipt of the working family payment, low-income working families, an extra €200 bonus being paid in April. The state exam fees have been waived. I mentioned what we've done on school transport as well. Free school books in primary school kick in September. And crucially, and this is something that's very close to my heart, is the introduction of free hot school meals. Something which happened under the previous government is being expanded under this government. And I know Minister Humphreys and Minister Rabbitte worked very hard on this, making sure, Mr Foley and Minister Humphreys and Minister Rabbitte worked very hard on this and making sure that it's being extended to all special schools, but also all primary DESH schools. And if we can guarantee that to children, think about it, in September, not too far away, every child in a DESH school getting a hot school meal. Every child in primary school getting free school books. Only a modest charge for school transport. I don't think it's fair to say that we're not interested in reducing child poverty. Just in the space of 1 year, a few months, measures taken like that, they're not insignificant, Deputy, and I think you're being a bit mean-spirited by not acknowledging it.
So, Taoiseach, the reason you're announcing these measures today is because you didn't do enough in the budget. Isn't that the reality of it? This package is evidence of that. But instead of learning from your mistakes, you're actually repeating them. So, look, can I quote the Children's Rights Alliance? They have repeatedly said that the qualified child increase is a crucial intervention to tackle child poverty. At the time of the last budget, the Vincent de Paul pointed out to you that growing up in poverty is associated with the worst outcomes across all aspects of all key aspects of a child's life. And what they said was that government should have invested additional supports to the poorest children through the qualified child payment. Now, Taoiseach, there has been an explosion in calls to the Vincent de Paul over the last year or so, and households with children accounted for 66% of those calls. Now, what further proof do you need that there is an absolute requirement for you to make a specific intervention in relation to weekly incomes for families, poor families who have children? So I'm asking you, Taoiseach, now today, will you reconsider the decision to ignore these children who are living in the poorest families by increasing the qualified child payment?
Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. The qualified child payment is a weekly payment, and alongside all weekly payments, we increased it in the budget. Only 7 or 8 weeks ago, we increased it in the budget. This was not a budget. We didn't increase any weekly payments in the announcement today. What we decided to do instead were targeted lump sum payments, including an extra €100 on the back-to-school clothing and footwear allowance, precisely for the children that you mentioned. A €200 additional payment for working family payment recipients, those are low-income working families, an additional €100 for all children, including those families, the introduction of hot school meals for every child in a DESH primary school, school transport being made affordable, the introduction of free school books, all happening this year. Can you give an example of a government in the last 5, 10, 20, 15, 30 years that did so much in such a short period of time? And the next step, extending free GP care to more children in low-income families. And I would challenge you to do that, actually, Deputy. Find me a government in the space of 1 year that has done as much as that.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy.